Hello, and welcome to today's dialogue on development research. My name is Carly Aveus, and I'm a project manager here at Stockholm Environment Institute, also known as SEI. I will be moderating today's session, and really looking forward to this. We have a lot of registered participants, and I think we'll have a lot of engaging discussions. Today, we will be delving into the issue of obsessive measurement disorder and bureaucracy, together with Janet Vähämäki and Susanna Alexius, who are the authors of a newly published book called Obsessive Measurement Disorder or Pragmatic Bureaucracy, Coping with Uncertainty in Development Aid Relations. So Susanna and Janet's research has focused on measurement and bureaucracy within the development aid sector. But I know that we have a quite diverse mix of participants today, and the lessons that we learn from Susanna and Janet's research, it can really be applied on other sectors as well. And I think that many of us will probably recognize either current or former organizations where we ourselves have worked in many of the examples that we'll hear about. So Susanna and Janet will speak about their research shortly. And after that, we will be joined by Duncan Green, who is an expert in international development and advocacy. And I really look forward to the more in-depth discussion that we'll get to hear between Duncan and the authors, Janet and Susanna. After the more in-depth discussion later, we will have time for a Q&A session. So please feel free to pose any questions you might have in the chat. We'll be moderating the chat or keeping an eye on the chat, all of the speakers, but also our awesome tech support, Annika and Amani, who are with us. So I'll briefly hand over to the main speakers, but first I would like to take the opportunity just to tell you a little bit more about the seminar series, the Dialogues on Development Research. So these dialogues are organized by the Swedish Development Research Network, SweDev, and also the Development Policy and Finance team at SEI. The aim of these dialogues on development research is to spread findings of development research by creating a learning space where researchers can share their work in a pretty informal and easily accessed setting. And that's one of the reasons that we also have this as a meeting format now instead of a webinar, just so we can see who's here in the meeting with us and also welcome you guys to speak later for questions and discussion. So who are we, the organizers? Yes, thanks, Annika, for changing the slide before. So SweDev, as I mentioned, stands for Swedish Development Research Network, and it's a member-based network connecting development researchers across Sweden in order to strengthen collaboration within the research community and to increase interaction between development researchers and practitioners. And within SweDev, there are a few different areas of work, but for example, SweDev facilitates collaboration between development researchers, practitioners, and policymakers based in Sweden. And SweDev also acts as a hub where one can find the latest news and opportunities on development research, and it's collected there in one place. We also organize conferences, workshops, and these dialogue series where researchers and policymakers can interact and share knowledge. To move on to the next slide, please. Just to mention briefly about SEI. So that's where I work. And SEI is an international nonprofit research and policy organization. And we tackle environment and development challenges through scientific research and also public policy advice. I belong to the development policy and finance team, as does Janet, one of the authors. And we are an interdisciplinary group of researchers working to support more equitable and sustainable development through demand-driven and solutions-oriented research. So with that introduction to these dialogues, I'm really happy to present our keynote speakers and the authors of the book, Susanna and Janet. So Susanna Alexius, you are an associate professor in business administration, and you are also the research director at Stockholm Center for Organizational Research, known as SCORE, at Stockholm University. And you have an extensive background in organizational research. And Janet Vähämäki, you are a senior researcher and team lead at SEI with a long background from the development aid sector in practice. And you also hold a business administration, a PhD in business administration. So welcome, and over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Carly, for that great introduction. Our book is here, you guys. It's exciting, and we're really happy to share this, joy with us. So finally finalizing this project. So I'm Susanna, and you're Jeanette. Yeah. So I would like actually to pose a very important question to you, Jeanette, that unbelievably I haven't posed to you in these years together in this project. So during your time, at SweDev, as an aid bureaucrat yourself, were you a pragmatic aid bureaucrat, or were you suffering at times from obsessive measurement disorder?
Oh, how come that question comes now? But
Well,
I definitely, I definitely think I was the both. I think all aid bureaucrats, as I, were sometimes very pressured to do something within the context, and were pressured to measure, do lots of measurement, which you then maybe push forwards to the recipients of aid. So I definitely fell into that trap, but also acting as a pragmatic bureaucrat where there was space, time for reflection, learning. And so I definitely think that I evolved as a pragmatic bureaucrat.
Well, that's hopeful. That's good to know. So before you get going, Jeanette, with our slides here, we would like to thank all of our informants for making it possible. We would like to thank our colleagues and extended network, and also, of course, a heartfelt thank you to our funder, the Swedish Research Council, that also funds our current research. So with that, Jeanette, please.
Okay, so to start with, this is the chapter outline of the book. And just to mention, the book is open access on the address below, so you can download it and read it. Main parts of the book are dealing with different ways of dealing with the uncertainty in development aid, and how to deal with kind of like not falling into the trap of obsessive measurement disorder. And to just don't miss that there are two important annexes in the book. So if you want a short read of the book, there is a summary annex on what is the OMD and what can be done about it. But there's also a methods chapter or an annex where we explain the research journey, how we came to the conclusions more in depth. So don't miss those ones. So to go to the topic of obsessive measurement disorder, these were the initial research questions that we had in our application to Swedish Research Council, who funded this research. When, how, and why does obsessive measurement disorder occur, and what can be done to prevent it? And the concept of obsessive measurement disorder was coined by Alexius, director for USAID, who wrote a paper in 2010 where he said that the whole aid business was somehow affected by obsessive measurement disorder, which meant then that they were very obsessed by regulations, measurements, and did not then have time to actually do the core business of aid work. So we wanted to, in the project, to dwell into this question. Some of the initial assumptions or hypotheses we were testing in the research was, the first one was that, was it so that the more regulations you have, the higher the prevalence of OMD? This is a very common, was common understanding both in literature and in discussions, that that's how it is, that we need to actually deregulate, we need to reduce the regulations, and then we wouldn't fall into that trap. The second one was that the more relationships in the aid chain, since there is lots of relationships and that there is this aid chain, that the donors on the top of the aid chain are pushing more regulations on that it increases when you go the further down the chain you come with when you come to the recipient. So we wanted to test that, is it actually so? And the third one was that that it's the external expert or the horizontal relations in the aid chain are actually selling these technologies, and then the higher the prevalence of OMD, because there's so many consultants and others who are involved and they are selling these technologies. So then that leads to more obsessive measurement disorder. This is the aid chain I was talking about, and we were in the aid chain. We were looking at in our method, we were looking at 4 different type of actor groups, which we were comparing. So it's aid through civil society organizations, aid through research organizations, aid through Swedish agencies or agency public support, and private sector support. And we were then comparing different type of both agreements between different organizations in the aid chain, from the top to the down to the recipient, and in between these 4 actor groups. We were also looking at all types of contracts, and so with external consultants and relations, that how did they actually, what happened in these relations. And we have around 80 interviews that we have done with the actors in this aid web on kind of like how they make sense of the regulations and what they do of the different regulations. And one of the points of departures of this research is that you typically talk about the different actors in between as intermediaries, but we took a point of departure that many of them are both recipients of the aid and they are also donors of aid. So they both receive, such as SweDev, receive or have the mandate to follow government regulations, and then they are also a donor. Some early conclusions then from what OMD is. We quite quickly found that when we were comparing these different types of regulations, that OMD is an individual experience of a perceived overregulation, and it depends very much on how rules and measurement schemes are actually developed, communicated, and used. So what we found is that there were some organizations who actually had very many regulations, and who felt that, no, but this is really, we are not feeling that we are overregulated. This is actually good for us. We feel that this is like developing our business, and we are doing something good about that, and we understand why we are doing it, and we are using the information from these regulations and from the results matrices for doing better aid practice. Whereas others who had very little regulations and had very not many indicators or results measurement schemes that were actually complaining and feeling frustrated, and felt very controlled and misunderstood in the business. So that's why the first assumption we had, that it's the amount of regulations, we declined that it's not the number of regulations and measurements who alone explain the prevalence of OMD, and that then sense making is really the key, that it's sometimes the regulations are found meaningful, and that increased oversight and control actually can lead to more positive outcomes, whereas in other times it does not so. So it very much depends on the context and how one makes sense of the regulations. This is a citation of one of our informants who said that it's not, if it's not documented, it does not exist. And if the results aren't in a report, there are no results. So this person felt that really was making sense, okay, that he didn't become frustrated about the fact that this is so, that results actually need to be documented, and so that's the only way they exist, but felt that this was the way of making sense of regulations. So that's just how business is, that you just need to document the results, and that's how the business is within aid. Another informant, this was one of the final recipients, a PhD student within the research aid chain, so to say, who said that when it was introduced, that then I was quite frustrated. Why are we doing this? So he was didn't really understand why they were introducing more results measurements. But then when he showed that, oh, but trust me, now I'm loving it. Yes, it's really giving me a push. Oh, it's like, wow. And when I'm submitting the report, I also have to present. And in my presentation, I have to show something new. So this person really felt that the additional reporting actually increased visibility of his work and communication and motivation, and that it was somehow that his work was actually seen and communicated about when results reporting was introduced. So when then question on when does OMD occur? Because we did see some of those cases of when there was an experience of OMD happening. It's in situations with very high external criticism, very high demands for certainty in an organization, and then you act by needing to introduce more measurement schemes in order to legitimize your work. It's short-sighted decision-making, very common that the political mandate is very short and you want to show results during that time period, whereas the results actually can take like 20 years to produce or so, but you just need to do it during that time period. Third factor here, that organizations have large number of newly employed staff who maybe don't know even about that there could be counterproductive effects of like in only full rule following or measurements, applying more measurement schemes, and are very stuck to that. And the more experienced employers are not given a voice, and learning does not happen. And the fourth one here, that organizations have a high staff turnover, which is very, very common in aid, that you start all over. New person comes in and you start again. And there's no learning taking place in between the persons. Stress and lack of slack time in the organization, very common. You don't have time to reflect and learn about what are we doing and how it's actually affecting the recipients. And the sixth one here, that there's a change in the professional competence of staff, which means that there's the core staff, or like program officers with thematic competence, are somehow power is more given to technical staff such as controllers, lawyers, IT staff, communicators, and that they take over decision making in the organization. So why does it occur? The second question, that, it's the strive for legitimacy and effectiveness, and that becomes counterproductive. We already mentioned that. And the lack of experiential knowledge, courage, and supportive administrative culture in the organization. However, the third one here may be the most important, that there's a vicious circle kind of in this, that if bureaucrats don't have time to actually meet with the partners and don't go to the field and kind of feel and experience that how are these requirements actually affecting the recipients, then they tend to become more dependent on these over time, on the different type of artifacts or so. So this interaction is very, very important.
So thank you, Jeanette, for that introduction on OMD. Okay, so just a few words on the case, because of course a lot of you listening are active in this field, but as you said, Carly, in the introduction, it's also a more general phenomenon these days, feelings of obsessive measurement disorder, or perhaps giving that diagnosis to someone else and so on. So, but this case of the development field is certainly also theoretically motivated in the sense that it's especially, complex, and complexity can be defined in different ways. One way of doing it is saying, how many different components, how many different actors are in the system, and also, fluid boundaries, who is doing what, is accountability really there, and so on. And also a lot of dynamic, both interaction and change taking place, making it very difficult to predict, what's going to happen next. And we also have this added sort of sensitivity of it being the taxpayers' money at stake. So this is also why we thought this field is particularly interesting to learn from, also for those of you in other sectors and operations. So moving on to what is perhaps our key figure found in the final chapter 8. In this figure, we want to represent how a surprising amount of informants, we thought, actually, they navigate in between the two dreaded extremes, where we have the hyper-bureaucracy extreme to the left, and we have the hyper-pragmatic extreme on the right. And these two extremes both have their really, dreadful sort of downsides. Obsessive measurement disorder being one, of course, of hyper-bureaucracy, but corruption and nepotism, being those frequently mentioned and associated with extreme pragmatism. So what we find is that a lot of our informants, they try to navigate these two extremes, looking for a sweet spot, as we call it, where, rules and systems can be used rationally when possible, but they also extend, sort of take responsibility for how they can actually be also developed when necessary. So moving on to that aspect, we also have a figure slightly developed here. We call it the responsibility radius, or ansvarsradie would it be in Swedish then. So this is to capture the difference between the hyper-bureaucrat, who's very sort of refined or defined in his or her responsibility, very close to the own tasks, and the pragmatic bureaucrat, who tends to extend, this is a metaphor of course, but extend the responsibility radius outward. It could be backward in time, asking, where did this project come from? What were the intentions really? Are there similar projects, from the past that we can learn from? It could also be, extending sort of one's responsibility in relation to other partners or other actors, both those involved in the project, but also additional ones. It could be also thinking about different perspectives that need to come in and values that need to be balanced in decision making. So we will illustrate this point in upcoming quotes. First, a note on a few key concepts that we introduce in the book and that we also develop and apply. So the first one we think is really important, like you mentioned, Jeanette, there's this common notion, of differentiating among aid organizations, saying that some are donors only, some are recipients only, and some, are intermediaries. We find that this at times, or actually in many cases, is quite misleading, because most of these organizations, and also then the decision makers operating on behalf of these organizations, they're actually, switching roles, switching hats, if you wish, between the donor perspective and the recipient's perspective. And this is a lot of implications discussed in the book. We also find that when coping with or responding to the great uncertainty in this field, practices of approximation are really common. And we introduce the concept of proper organization proxy, or POPs, and we will talk more about that shortly. We also find that in terms of trust, trust and control are usually depicted as opposite sort of forces. But here we find that regulation and measurements and all of that, which has been heavily criticized also during new public management, it's actually somewhat of a trust paradox that we find that these are really, really important for the inter-organizational trust in the field, for the assessments made, and we'll get more into that. And on a hopeful note, the multivocal brokering, the skills of translating and decoupling between sort of the field practices and the regulatory requirements is something that is super important and also can act as a counterproductive, can counteract tendencies towards obsessive measurement disorder.
Okay, so we have this is then the very classic result change narrative on how inputs become activities, outputs, outcome, impact, and effects. And then you see the results here in the end. And this is a picture from 70s at SweDev when this is the way how aid should be working. You kind of input money and then things would happen in the end. And the picture we think is rather the more correct one on what aid bureaucrats are doing is that they are in these two, what we call in the book, two management dreams of simplifying the complex. It's very complex environment, so there is a necessity to always simplify it in order to take decisions and to control the future. The future is, of course, come to impacts, and no doubt it's not. We don't know. There's so many uncertainties there that is it actually the aid money who is leading to those impacts? So, but there is, of course, in order to put in money into this and finance aid projects, you need to somehow control and show to taxpayers and so that you are in control. So lots of the business of aid bureaucrats is actually to use into this input is before projects are even started, and all the that you are documenting in artifacts, you are ticking boxes, and in meetings with others in order to take the decisions to start up project activities. And
yeah, this was just another, representation. Most of you have probably seen this online during the COVID years. Be sure to wash your hands and all will be well, we said in the city here. But of course, there's a great risk here of neglecting the long-term perspectives and, the how that will potentially impact the project. So we see that there may be sometimes a tunnel vision where what is available sort of here and now to show it takes over, tends to dominate. And so there's sort of a mission drift to this pre-project phase and what can be available at this point in time. We also discuss mismatching temporalities, as already mentioned by you, Jeanette. A lot of projects have only a 3-year or 5-year time period, while the sort of real temporalities going on out there in the field and what needs to be changed has much longer time horizon than that. And that is a constant struggle by these aid bureaucrats to stretch out the responsibility radius then into the future and also ponder, what will this look like sort of 3-4 project periods onwards.
So the concept of trust transference was already mentioned by Susanna, but typically in trust theory, it's then that trust is created in personal relations between a truster and a trustee, and that's what creates trust. However, in aid business, and what we have looked at here is that the truster it's between organizations typically. So the truster is an organization providing aid to another organization, and the personal relations are here then insufficient, and there's also this long change and there are lots of other actors. So there is then a very high need of these impersonal sources of trust, which are then third-party consultants, or there's rules and technologies and measurement schemes. And there's also very high, like, the fear of why don't you then only trust in this in personal relations, is that there is this very fear of nepotism and corruption in aid. So of course there's a necessity also always. So it's understandable that there is this trust paradox in aid business, that you need to use lots of these types of like measurement schemes and so. However, this then, what it leads up to is that there's very much focus on what we call proper organizations, and then these proper organizations proxies, what we will come to talk about more, rather than actually what happens in the activities of the organizations, or the effects of it. So it's to make sure that the organizations are proper enough in order to get financing.
And a proper organization needs to have proper plans, of course. And this can be frustrating at times when, the project setting is very uncertain and very dynamic. And here's one informant saying, well, I have this donor telling me in a very accusatory tone that, you must have an environmental plan for your project. But, we weren't even sure at that point in time, which area, was it the northern Tanzania or southern Tanzania? And would it be water issues or land issues or whatnot? And that informant of ours tried to explain that to the donor, but felt that she wasn't really heard or understood. So this also illustrates how to deal with a sort of dynamic circumstances in the field versus the more rigid requirements of bureaucracy. Here is another example of an informant who was actually courageous enough to bring this up in the final minutes of a focus group interview with this project that was supposed to be about, improving climate work in agencies. And so he was a climate expert himself. And I think this illustrates perhaps his frustration, or at least, the questions raised about whether he was himself a proxy on this project, right? You need to have a climate expert on, check the box, or whether his competences would actually be, important to implementation in this project. So 1.5 years on, or a lot of attention had been placed into learning the proper project management method, first from consultants, and then teaching partners this same project method.
Okay, so then to our third assumption that we had in the beginning, we were looking at, okay, so would the horizontal relations or consultants are they the ones who are causing, like when obsessive measurement disorder happens? We have a chapter dealing with this, looking at the use of consultants in aid from 1960s until today, and have these different eras, and so I won't go into that. However, just one thing on the use of consultants, that typically consultants are employed or contracted to reduce uncertainty somehow. But a pattern we have found is that often it creates new uncertainties, because they, of course, bring up some things that are like not part of the project, and so, and then you need to contract new consultants. Typically, that's the response. So it creates uncertainty, this type of an loop of uncertainty, creating like new uncertainties. And just to whether it's then our response to whether is it the consultants who are driving some type of more or obsessive measurement disorder, and they just want to sell their technologies and logical frameworks. And so our response is that It depends. We have looked at different consultancy bureaus and how their approaches and what they do. And some definitely, yes, that's what they go into the business with. But there are very many consultants we have also found among our informants who are very much the pragmatic bureaucrats as well in this business. Like this citation is from one of them, where he says that it's often the partners who want more measurements, and they think that SweDev wants them, and they think that SweDev is saying something else. But we need to come in the middle and kind of explain, but no, this is not, you don't need it actually. It's they have changed the rules. And so that's a very common approach, that consultants actually also can act as pragmatic bureaucrats. So it's like this, and this finding then really indicates is that the criticism towards consultants, we think, is quite unjustified, and there's some type of prejudices towards consultants, and that it needs to be much more nuanced, like who is doing what.
So this is a very common quote by our informants, as a larger population, that it's how to make the system work for you, for your project, for your partners, without getting into this trap of corruption, nepotism, getting too close in personal relations and so on. So you don't break any rules, but you want to, tweak, adjust, so on, so that you can really protect what is deemed then essential for the project in the short, but also in the longer run. And this is, we think, a quite fun example where one of the informant organizations here used this metaphor of a fruit salad for their operations. And this, I think, is a head controller that says to us that, we are quite pragmatic in the sense that we want to just keep, steady state with our operations that we believe in. So, but we adjust instead the way that we report on this same sort of steady state operations. So, donor A might want to know all about the bananas and only the bananas, and some other donor, wants to know both about kiwis and the oranges. So what we do then is that we decouple, we take responsibility for, using our judgment to say, this is the proper things to keep doing on the ground, so to speak, but we will report differently according to the needs of our different donors. So this is an example of what we call translation and decoupling skills that pragmatic bureaucrats often have. Another example here where administrative judgment and courage can actually also be transferred in the system. And it can be like very fine nuances in the sense that, a partner might wonder, do we need this matrix? Can we skip it? No, better keep it. But perhaps we can adjust the number of indicators, for example. In another case, it can be, we can skip this matrix, in this case. So it's a lot about judgment, administrative judgment, but also the courage both to pose the question and to create some learning in these relations.
Okay, so to maybe sum up, lots of this has already been said, like what is then the pragmatic bureaucrat which can navigate in the system. So it's one who really knows when and how to bend rules and navigate the systems. It's one who really dares to take responsibility and dares to walk the extra mile to protect the core purpose of a business. Is prepared to go against the ideal of formal compliance when found it meaningless, with respect to partners' well-being and project aims. Is interested to learn what worked and what did not, and uses this insight to adjust and make sense of administration. So one who listens and learns from key partners and different types and sources of information, also research findings, to take better decisions. And also dares to be vulnerable and curious about the unknown, and not saying that I know everything the best. The hyper bureaucrat, the other stereotype we use in the book, is one very much assumes responsibility only for its own job task, and with an emphasis on strict rule following and box ticking, and seldom sees the bigger picture of how change actually happens and gets stuck in sub-optimizing. Maybe oversimplifies then complexity and is obsessed with removing uncertainty and thinks that it's removable fully. Has an unrealistic belief in the role of measurements. Has a lack of awareness that control and measurement system actually can cause counterproductive effects. And sometimes then acts in fear of losing control, or fear is a very important word here, of losing one's job. And what we have seen in our interviews, that this person can be very harmful in very powerful positions and cause that there is an experience of obsessive measurement disorder among colleagues.
So wrapping up, what can you do to avoid OMD? I think we've said it pretty much already, but ensure that you have pragmatic bureaucrats on board, honor them, and create opportunities for them to foster these skills, and also create awareness on the effects of the current control and measurement rituals, and enable opportunities also to worry about them and to talk about your fears. So that could be really constructive, we think. Worry periods, for example. And last but not least, it's a balancing act still. We've mentioned this trust paradox that we've been written about earlier. We can't assume that all regulation and measurements can be omitted in this field. They will have to be there because it's super, super complex and uncertain. And we need to hold on to something in that type of environment. But we need to understand and make sense of why it's there. And that's super important. So, final slide.
Yeah, so some takeaways then, summary of what we have said is that, what matters most is not the amount of regulations. That's not what defines OMD. It's how these are introduced, communicated, and motivated, what you do about them.
And it's super important then to have staff on board that has not only knowledge, but also the courage to make sense of and also interact with these rules and measurement technologies, in a meaningful way.
And then that the highest risks of OMD is then seen in situations where a bureaucrat actually stops caring and taking responsibility for how bureaucracy affect the parties involved. It's this interaction and actually knowing that how does what I do actually affect the recipients or the other partners that you are doing, and only looks at in a tunnel vision on its rules and regulations.
So with that, thank you very much for your attention during this presentation, and very welcome to reach out to us also. Here are our email addresses. So we're looking forward to the discussion and your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna and Janet. Super informative, and I think there's a lot to dig into. And to do that, we actually have Duncan Green here with us to help us dig into it a little bit deeper. Duncan, you're an expert in international development and advocacy, and you do a lot of things, but to mention a few I've listed, and you can add if you want. You're a professor in practice at LSE's International Development Institute, and then you're a strategic advisor to Oxfam. And you also write a blog called From Poverty to Power. Please feel free to introduce yourself more if you want to add, but otherwise I would love to hear from you what has been going on in your mind when listening to Susanna and Janet. What are your reflections? And also, welcome to lead the discussion with Susanna and Janet to dig a bit deeper. Thank you.
Thanks, Carly. And thanks, Janet and Susanna. I love the fruit salad metaphor. I'm definitely going to steal that. That was really good. I'll just do a little 10-minute discussion spiel, and then I've got some questions for you, and then we can open up if that's okay. So, first of all, I think it's a really useful addition to a literature on aid, but obviously goes beyond aid. But it builds on the work of some of my heroes like Ros Eiben, Daniel Honig, who are looking at the reality of what people actually do rather than all this theory stuff that we talk about. And I think it comes to broadly similar conclusions, which is great. So there's a body of work building up there. It did add some things. Some of the things that struck me. I love the idea of plural actorhood. You know, Robert Chambers talks about whether you're an upper or a lower in any relationship. And of course, you can be both in different relationships. So people who are having to take, pardon my French, a load of crap from a donor, then become the person who dishes out the crap when they're in a position of handing out the money. And that's interesting because it also gives you the chance, if you can get people to reflect, for people to have experienced both positions, for people to be more flexible, I think. I love this idea of the general ideal of a proper organization as a proxy for uncertainty. And it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, right? The good thing is that it's saying we should core fund organizations that look like they're going to get good stuff done. So it could be a kind of path to institutional cash transfers, to trust-based giving. Or it can be only funding organizations that look like us. And suddenly you take a rich ecosystem and squash it down into mini-me kind of clones, and that would be a real shame. So I'm excited by the possibilities of funding organizations rather than projects, but it has to be done right. I love the critique of external experts who the consultants are like the priests, modern day priests, who bring you uncertainty and an extraordinary ability to see into the future, which is pretty much what priests do. But also, with slightly contradiction, they also generate this really weird loop where the more experts you have, the more uncertain you become, and the more experts you need to hire, which is great. So it's like some terrible drug which people get hooked on if they do it wrong. I mean, I do a lot of consultancy, so don't get me wrong. The right expert in the right place, absolutely. But it's how they work and what pretensions to certainty they produce. And what, it was interesting what you were saying about how the consultants can tell people, actually, you don't have to tick all those boxes. They'll know the donor better, and they can help people navigate through this stuff. So there's good and bad, but managing your experts and getting the right kind of experts seems pretty clear. The other thing I liked, I mean, of a long list, I really liked sort of multivocal brokering. So I've done some studies on DFID and foreign office projects on adaptive management. And what you definitely see there is the successful one construct a chain of trust where you have the donor, senior management, and then the delivery people on the ground. And as long as that chain of trust works, then you can get really good results on things like governance reform, for example. So the donor trusts the management consultant, for example, to spend money wisely. They don't want to be in the room with everybody. They don't want to pore over all the detail. I looked at a really interesting project in the Philippines, which had a read-only dashboard for its donor, the Australian government in this case, so they could see what they were measuring, but they weren't allowed to fiddle with it or ask questions. It was really good. And that gave them enough information, enough trust. And then the piggy in the middle has to know what donors need to keep them happy, be a good manager in case the people on the ground aren't doing anything, but also hold an umbrella over them so that they can get on with their job, which is working on the ground. There's an example in Tanzania where there was this very well-intentioned woman from DFID who insisted on being in the room with grassroots staff in Tanzania because she said, I'm married to a Zimbabwean. I'm basically an African. Why would they be scared of me? And when she came into the room, all the Tanzanian staff just went quiet because the power was in the room. And she was completely unaware of this. So how do you keep that chain of trust? Now, the fragility of that chain is a real problem. And the fragility is when something goes wrong. And suddenly the trust is lost and people say, oh, we're going to have to keep a closer eye on this. We're going to get into trouble with our bosses back in London or Stockholm or wherever. And suddenly that chain collapses in on itself and you're back to compliance. But I think the weakest link in most of the projects I've looked at is the donor part. And that's because of churn. That's because of the speed of staff turnover. And that's something I wanted to come back to. I thought there were a couple of areas you could have gone into more. One of the interesting things looking back over the last 15, 20 years is the shift to HTMBs, hard to measure benefits. All right, things like women's empowerment, norm change, and those all create a lot of problems for people with OMD, right? Because they're much harder to measure, much more expensive to measure. They take longer to measure, and it's more contested. So, does that, as one of the questions in the chat, actually lead to people skewing their aid programs towards easy to measure benefits, or if not, what does that shift to norm change and hard to measure benefits mean for what you're talking about? And also, I wasn't convinced by bureaucrats using approximations, or maybe I just didn't understand it. I think they use heuristics, rules of thumb, right? So typically they'll have a bunch of things which are a compass rather than a map, and they'll make decisions on a daily basis through these rules of thumb. I worked in DFID for a brief period, and the rules of thumb were pretty neoliberal economic. It's like, will this open up markets? Will this get rid of European subsidies? And they didn't do thinking slow analysis of the evidence, or they had some rules of thumb. So I think it'd be good to look at the heuristics people are using. On this. Right, that's my discussion bit. Some questions. Shall I just ask them all and then just hand over to you? Is that okay? Yeah. So you say aid is an extreme case of a gap between certainty and improvisation. I just wonder why. I've got some theories. Is it that it's seen as particularly politically fragile, the support for aid, and therefore people are particularly anxious? Is it the sheer distance between the decision makers' lives and what the money's been spent on? So they might be willing to accept a bit more improvisation, pragmatism when it's about schools and hospitals in Sweden, but when it's something you know nothing about, that need for the illusion of control is greater, or is it something else? So why do you think aid is an extreme case? The really big one, how do you create the culture that allows sufficient pragmatism given the structure of the aid industry? So you've got this churn, which you're not going to stop. People's jobs rely on them moving every 2 or 3 years. They need to get promoted or whatever. So if you had to live with the churn, how on earth do you build that expertise and self-confidence when people are flying in and flying out all the time? This is the thing that gets me all the time. I really like your list in Annex 2 for the wonks who read annexes of factors that lead to counterproductive OMD. But I think you need to go further, or you could go further on what to do about them. So one way I do this is, if something's not happening and you want it to happen, think about ideas, interests, and institutions. So in this case, ideas would be, they can't be trusted with our money. We're going to get into trouble. This all quasi racist or Islamophobic or whatever it is, things going on sometimes in the back of people's minds. Interest is, somebody makes money out of doing this, like out of the status quo, and they will resist changes. And then institutions is 3-year project cycles. Evaluators got to evaluate, measurers got to measure. There'll be people pushing back against all this stuff. But I'd be interested in your ideas on those questions.
Great. Wow, thank you, Duncan. That is very, encouraging for us to hear that you found, things worthwhile in the project, and certainly also pointing at really worthwhile, avenues for further research. And we just came out of the research application cave. We've been there for the past month or so. So we have actually sent out a lot of applications for what we hope is a continued project. And especially, I would say, speaking to your second point here of how to create this atmosphere, we've actually reached out to unions also, and to other professional organizations, trying to where can we discuss this in the right way? So we're really interested in that, and we also have a lot of quotes on that we couldn't really fit into this volume. So there's a lot of frustration. For example, we didn't mention it here, but in one of our focus groups, after 1.5 hours or so, this was a focus group with 5 senior aid officers at SIDA. And so after like 1.5 hours, one of them said suddenly, look, it just struck me, why don't we ever have this kind of meta discussion, in our everyday life? And, whatever happened to poverty? I mean, we do our best. We want to be the good donors. We count what we need to count and so on. But whatever happened to poverty? We need these types of meta discussions. So really a lack of those collegial opportunities to share, but also a lack of courage. So I think that psychological safety is something that it's a concept that we find interesting here. Would you like to speak of the extreme case?
No, definitely. I think, aid, an extreme case, it's both of the factors you mentioned, the political, that it's very vulnerable, of course, that you just take from aid and then you need to stop the business. And so it's very vulnerable to political changes in government, as we've seen in Sweden at the moment. And but also on this, the broken feedback loop, or what you were raising, kind of like that aid is only visible for the taxpayers in the donor country if you actually get those results, and they don't see it. They are not there in their daily life. It's not a school. You put your kids to school and you see what happens there. Aid is something else. It's happening in another country, and so the distance is very long, and it's not tangible for those who take decisions on aid allocations. So it is an extreme case in that way, that it's very volatile, and so but of course this is something, the obsessive measurement disorder and pragmatic, it's something very relevant for all political fields, not only for aid. We think that it's these discussions happening.
We also would like, to spread the word sort of on development aid research beyond that community, this community, because I think, at least in Sweden now, but throughout, considering what's happening with Putin and the other forces around us, this idea of a total defense of creating awareness and dealing with the unknown, the uncertain to come, and so on. I think that those are very hot issues, and of course this is a field where this has been around for ages, these types of discussions. So we think it's very timely to learn from this case.
Can I come back on something? Do you mind putting your slides up and going back to the qualities of the pragmatic bureaucrat?
Sure. We find them. This one.
That's it. So I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a famous British comedy called Yes Minister, all right, which it's a hilarious one in which the minister runs rings round. The senior civil servant runs rings round the minister, right? And his favorite way of terrifying his minister is by saying, "That's very brave, minister." So you're saying that people need to be courageous. And my question to you is, if you exhibit these qualities, in which development ministries or other ministries do you get promoted? I'm not sure. Right now, looking at FCDO, the UK one, I'm not sure this will get you promoted. I think it might just draw unwelcome attention and a rapid suggestion that you find another career. So I'm just, this culture question is really huge. There's another potential avenue for your research, is to just try this with USA, try it with DFAT, try it with whatever comes up in the UK, and see which of these HR recognizes as assets rather than liabilities.
Yeah, and we've discussed that a lot also in this research application process recently, that perhaps it needs to be undercover. Perhaps this needs to be a less sort of out there activist approach. We're not really sure. Some people would like it to be not sensitive at all. Common sense, really, no rocket science. of course, you have to be brave and you have to question and problematize and so on. So for some of our informants, this is like, well, you know, what is a lack of responsibility? That is ticking all the boxes, and that is staying silent and so on. So this is where we find this concept of psychological safety really interesting, because it points to the importance of being courageous and speaking your mind and so on, and then creating an atmosphere that could allow that. But of course, I mean, I think you're right at present that it's not easy to get promoted in many cases.
Final points, then let's go to Q&A, because I don't want to hog things. But yeah, this list is quite individual, right? And this reminds of what you just said, just prompted me to think back of the work of Ros Iben, which basically showed that there is there are certainly in DFID, there were a series of tribes, right? And those tribes looked out for each other, they supported each other, they gave each other courage, and they gave each other the willingness to bend the rules and not do what they were told. And the most dynamic and effective of them were the feminists, right? So the feminists were constantly in a situation of dual allegiance, where they had some allegiance to DFID, but they had a lot of allegiance to the women's rights movement, and they were quite willing to fight that corner. I think you have something similar on adaptive management, thinking and working politically, much weaker ideologically though. So the pragmatic bureaucrat also needs a network, needs a tribe. And I think that's one of the key ways to create the culture and then encourage it and make it more sustainable. Okay, I'm going to be quiet now. So Carly, are you taking questions or am I?
Yeah.
I can assist with that. We have received several questions, and to start with, I've invited Gustavo to pose his question, and so I'm going to send him an unmute invite here so that he can speak himself instead of me just repeating what he wants to say. So one moment, let me find his name there. Gustavo,
yes,
you should be able to speak.
I got the invitation, I think. It's unmuted now.
Yes, we hear you. Thanks for joining.
First of all, thanks for the presentation. And the book has been amazing because it has helped me put names to a lot of things that I've been observing. So thank you for that. My question was, where do you most often observe the expression of this OMD by the donors? Like formally, do you see it more like in the requirements for the project applications, or after the projects in the monitoring and audit reports and evaluation reports? Or is something that happens, you know, extra requirements that are imposed during the project cycle? I wanted to like see the formal expression, the instrumental expression of this OMD. Thank you.
I think it's in all of what you said. It's kind of it could be both in pre-appraisals of it, and and then this typically if this trust loop takes place, then that the recipient feels that it's not trusted, and then more regulations asked, and they don't understand, like, why are they asking us for this, the regulations, and then and no talk happening. Maybe you start like only emailing, and you kind of like don't actually communicate about it and don't explain why the rules are needed, and then a very bad vicious circle happens and throughout the project phase. And sometimes what we've seen, these loops, that they need to be somehow interrupted, and someone leaves, or you like replace them on either sides, that the personal trust kind of like gets interrupted, and you just need to do something in order to rebuild the trust here again, and somehow get into same communication between the actors.
And it could also be the case actually that the same amount of sort of regulation is first perceived to be sort of excessive. But then when trust has been built and, you know, boxes have been ticked for a while, then you can take a step back on both sides and have a more pragmatic sort of approach to why, you know, we have it. It's a complex to answer, but of course it can also be post a scandal, like you said, Duncan, that then you can really see the fear in those on the donor side, of course, understandably.
Thank you. Gustavo, are you happy with your answer? Great, thumbs up. Oh yeah, we have the unmute setting. Next, I'm gonna ask Magdalena Eriksson to please pose your question.
Thank you, and thank you for a really nice and informative presentation. So I'm thinking that, or wondering if everything really is measurable, or if you have come across like there are ideas that they're difficult. It's difficult to set metrics for them, and therefore you know that this is not going to be liked by funders, and therefore you feel discouraged to even proceed and try to do those kinds of interventions. Do you see any of that the sort of metrics nips the idea in the bud because you think it's hard to realize in a measurable way?
Yeah, I mean, this is super interesting. I think we will write more about it because it actually goes both ways. In our current project that we do now, the follow-up project, we're looking at how the different actor, whether there is something called isomorphism, so whether the different types of actors, for example, an agency and a civil society organization, whether the demands are making them more similar. Right, so the similar form, isomorphism. So we look into that, and we see that sort of the hopeful approach to your question would be that when you prove that you are a proper organization, if you don't forget your own fruit salad that you had, going on, then you can be a proper organization, sort of in the standard format, but then keep doing your more qualitative, maybe long-term, harder to measure. You were also into this, Duncan, with your example earlier of what is hard to measure. So the literature would say that the standard the standard process would be that we can find over time a mission drift. So that when you go to what is easily measured and you get attention for that, it's easier to get financing and so on. But for those who, are there to protect the core mission of the organization, we see a lot of counteracting as well. So you can get a status, in the system that you are a proper organization, and then you can do the more qualitative stuff. That is what we have been told a lot.
Mm-hmm. Duncan, would you like to come in here with any reflections?
If I may, if that's okay with you, Susanna.
Yes, please.
So two stories really, one from DFID, one from USAID. So DFID, I was on a panel with a DFID lifer a few years ago, who said he could see a cycle in this, right? So I think this goes back to your question of the timeline, that every time there's a scandal, every time there's a headline in the right-wing tabloids, a new layer of compliance or risk management is put in, and the amount of treacle that messes up the works increases. And then at a certain point, it becomes untenable, no one can make any decisions, and there's a big bonfire, and you get back to a situation where people can make decisions, which happened in DFID in 2015 when there was a kind of staff insurrection, and the minister actually put in the kind of secret shopper arrangement where two members of staff tried to find how many layers of sign-off were needed to get some money out of DFID, and it was 39. And the Secretary of State was an accountant and went, oh my God. And they got it down to 5. But then each time there's a change in the minister or a problem, there'll be another one. And so it's interesting, that cycle. The second one was, which also speaks to your last point, which is, I was at a meeting at USAID a few years ago where USAID had decreed that all their contractors were going to be adaptive, right? Which is not quite what adaptive management is about. But anyway, that's what they were saying. And then they said to them, and these are all the big beltway bandits, the $1 billion plus kind of contractors, the big guys. And they said, right, go away and huddle and come back to us and say what you need to carry out these new direction. And what they basically came back after they'd discussed it and said, we don't believe you, right? You are the senior guys, the policy guys, the experienced people. You want us to be adaptive and be pragmatic bureaucrats, and that's great. but you're not the people we talk to every day. The people we talk to every day are the people with dandruff, who are putting their kids through school, who just want an easy life. They will stop us. So the only way this is going to work is if you give us a hotline so that we can go above them if they start stopping us being, in this case, adaptive. So I think you've got to think about the power structure within the donor and how you circumvent that or change it in order to allow that culture to emerge.
Yeah, that's we have exactly the similar type of conclusions in the book, where we looked at there was this trust paradigm in Sweden, with trust-based management was to be implied everywhere. And at SweDev there was a simplification agenda, that we will like have simplified rules and so. But then what we were looking at were how was this understood? And even though it was like, okay, you should be doing adaptive management in the handbooks and everything, and this is how you should be simplifying things, and however, it really depended on the relations and how it was understood among the program officers and the counterparts on what was actually done, and not at all that you can't kind of like write it that this is the way you do. It's the culture and how you cultivate the culture. That's the key really for learning how to do adaptive management or whatever, pragmatic bureaucracy or navigation by judgment, whatever you call it. It's about like talking to it and having these networks, and so that was earlier said.
Yeah, and I mean the key issue is risk, right? So Keynes said in financial markets, it's okay to fail as long as you fail the same way as everybody else. But if you fail differently, you get punished, right? And so I think we're talking a bit about something like that here, where if you're trying to do something more interesting like you're talking about, you will fail differently, and therefore you have to be allowed to do that, protected for doing that, even if it gets you on the front page of a tabloid. So one of the DFID funded a really good women's project in Ethiopia, which was using song and dance to put out messages around sexuality and HIV. And the Daily Mail turned it into DFID funds Spice Girls in Ethiopia. And it caused absolute catastrophe, right? They were cut immediately with no warning. So that was an example of not having the backs of people who are trying to do things differently. So I think just thinking about what you do when things go wrong differently is a really crucial part of this.
Definitely.
So I know that Duncan brought up this thing of cycles, and Janet, I know that some of your previous research studied like the cycles and how much reporting is required. And we did get a question in the chat, and David, I'll hand over to you to pose your question, because I think it links really well to this. So David.
Yes, hello, hi, Susanna and Janet. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
As I know, Janet, that you started your research in time you're working at SweDev, and then we had the then Minister of Development Cooperation had a lot of ideas to change the plan. So my question is a little bit like this: is OMD, is it left wing or right wing? Is there a correlation with the government in power? The current government today put a lot of emphasis on one hand on transparency and accountability. On the other hand, they emphasize quite a lot more control, more detailed control. Looked like a contradiction to me, but that's another side. But is it left wing or right wing, or it doesn't have anything to do with politics?
Yeah. I think from my previous research on my PhD was really about these waves of reform, where I looked from the 60s until today at SweDev, and saw that they were more measurements or more quantitative interest and pressure towards Swedish aid every 10 to 12 years, and that came back. And I was then predicting I finished my PhD in 2017 and was predicting that, okay, 2023 to 2025, we are there again. There will be a quantitative peak again, and we're there now. And I definitely think that we see it with the current government. However, historically, looking at the Swedish context, it has not been only the right-wing push to want more quantitative measurements and in aid. It has been during the social democratic dominance as well. And my explanation in my thesis was really that it's more about that we forget about. It's more about that we just need to like reintroduce some new. It just needs to come back somehow, like these quantitative measurements, and there's these peaks of, and then we tend to forget like what went wrong last time when we put such a pressure to only quantify, and so and we don't learn so much from the past, so even though we would have a social democratic government in Sweden today, they might be kind of there again to pushing for more. So kind of trust and adaptive management, doing different development differently peak for a while now, and
Thank you, Janet. I think, I think that many wondered about this political aspect. David, I hope you're happy with your question. We're starting to come towards the end of our session, but I would like to invite Jonathan to pose his question as a last question from the participants, and then we're going to wrap up. So Jonathan, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks Susanna and Janet. Really interesting presentation, interesting book. I just sort of trying to reflect as a career SweDev bureaucrat on the sort of your model and your idea. And I think one thing, of course, as we've been discussing now about the sort of the shift organizationally or over time in different organizations, but one of the key things I think is, or one of the experiences I have is when I sort of not only rule breaking, but also like, let's say, working around the rules, but also trying to change the rules. Yeah. And I think, that depends a lot on, partly on the willingness of organizations, the openness to change. And also the fact that, I mean, when you talk about rules, it sort of sounds like one sort of standard layer, but of course, in reality, a bureaucracy is made up of multiple levels of sort of instructions, rules, policies, regulations, and so on. And there's more or less flexibility in that. And I think, so it sort of, it seems to me that there's a big range of options, depending how individual bureaucrats feel about the situation. But the more open the organization is and the more progressive the rules are, it's more or less important to be that sort of the pragmatism that you talk about. So it's just a reflection there, and maybe a question about, how much do you need to work around the rules versus changing them? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that comment and question, Jonathan. Actually, in one of our applications that we have to keep our fingers crossed for, we're very interested in legal expertise and how, the legal sort of departments come in. And this is more general in the public sector, in the public administration, in that perspective, because we talk, when we've introduced this topic in the past years, in different, executive education settings and seminars and so on, people have often come up to us in the break saying, look, I want to be an enabling lawyer, or, I want to be an enabling controller and change the rules and be enabling rather than the stop sign for everything. So I think this is also why we reached out now to unions. So we think that this is a super important discussion also for administrative resilience, which is another concept that we deal with now. So thank you. I think it's we agree that there are many options here, choosing among a set of rules. There are standards, there are directives, you can make amendments, you can, navigate this in so many ways. But of course, for that to happen, we have to learn more of these practices that today are mainly, I think, hidden from view and from public debate.
Janet or Duncan, would you like to add anything there?
No, I'm fine.
But Duncan has something he wants to say.
Still something, but I shouldn't be the last person to speak. I mean, I'm just okay. One quick thing, which is this idea of hidden ecosystems that you just raised. So I'm a huge fan of an expanding area of methodology, which is diaries. Not diaries kept by the people, but going in and interviewing them every month for over a year and saying, how did you resolve your issues? And we've done it on governance, we've done it on water, we've done it on environment, conflict, and you find ecosystems that you didn't know existed. So, I mean, if you've not already, it looks like you're already doing it.
Yeah, that's what we have written about in the applications.
Excellent. Well, I hope you get the funding, because it's been an incredibly productive methodology. It's cut price ethnography, and we found such interesting things by using them. So great.
We will look at your work there, Duncan, because we also believe that is a fruitful avenue further.
I've been in touch with people at IDS who've been doing it. It's great.
Yeah. So yeah, if I don't know if we're closing up, but
well, I did want to ask if you have some last words you would like to say before I wrap up.
I think, at least for me, I'm super excited to continue this research, and thank you so much for the attention. And don't forget, the book is available. You know, we paid a lot. SCORE actually funded this open access possibility. So spread the word, and also get in touch with us with any, you know, we're not afraid of critique. So you can also bring it on, or your best examples or whatever. We're very appreciative. So yeah.
Yeah, no, just really echoing that. Please contact us, both for individual discussions. We're very open to continue talking to those of you who didn't have the possibility to talk to today, and both individually or in groups. And if you want to email us your diary stories, kind of like what do you do? And so we're very, if you want to be involved in further research on how you do and how you cope, we are very interested in that. So just open email box and phone from our side. And thanks.
And thank you so much to you, Duncan, for taking the time to read, and for such encouraging, you know, comments and suggestions.
Great.
And to all of the team behind with
exactly
company.
Exactly. Thank you, everyone involved. Amani, Annika, and of course the speakers, and also a large amount of participants. We were up to around 90 for a while, but now while we're closing, we've decreased, and that's to be expected. Just to mention, the next dialogue on development research will be held later this spring, probably in May. If you want to find out information about the next session, the best way to receive it is to sign up for SweDev's newsletter. Maybe Annika or Amani can post the link again in the chat, so you can sign up if you're not signed up yet. If you have suggestions for future speakers, or if you yourself want to present your research, feel free to reach out to me. I'm coordinating these dialogues now, so reach out with recommendations. And yeah, a huge thank you for everyone who participated today, and we'll cross our fingers for Susanna and Janet that you get the funding to keep doing the interesting research you do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.